I was the only one who cared for my sick husband in his final days. When he died, in the will, my son Kyle got his father's multi-million-dollar company. I was left with the old farmhouse. My son mocked me in front of everyone at the lawyer's office. You took care of him your whole life, and all you got was this ruin. I deserve more. Then Stephen, the lawyer, said in a strange voice. Actually, my son turned pale. What happened next changed everything. But to understand how we got to that moment, I need to tell you something nobody knew. Something that was hidden in that old farmhouse Kyle despises so much. Something my husband Arthur planned for months before he died. What my son couldn't imagine is that behind that humiliation was a plan that would change everything forever. Let me take you back 3 months. Arthur was in the hospital bed at home, with tubes connected to his fragile body. I slept in a chair next to him every night. I wiped his forehead when he sweat. I held his hand when the pain was unbearable. I patiently fed him when he could no longer hold a spoon. I am 64 years old, and every muscle in my body ached from the sleepless nights, but I never complained. He was my husband, the man I had built a life with for 42 years. Kyle came to visit him exactly twice in those 3 months. The first time he stayed for 15 minutes, staring at his phone the entire time, talking about important meetings and contracts he needed to close. The second time, he didn't even come into the room. He stayed in the living room talking on the phone, in that loud, arrogant voice he always used when talking about business. Your father is resting, I told him. He nodded without looking at me and left. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't ask if I needed help. He just left. Arthur noticed everything. Even though he was weak, even though the cancer was stealing his strength, his mind was still clear as water. One night, while I was changing his sheets, he took my hand with a strength he hadn't had in weeks. Eleanor, he whispered, I need you to trust me. No matter what happens after I'm gone, trust me. His eyes shined with something that wasn't just tears. It was determination. It was a secret. I didn't understand what he meant until the day of the funeral. Kyle arrived late to the ceremony, dressed in an expensive gray suit, with his wife Jessica hanging off his arm like just another accessory. Throughout the service, he checked his phone. When it was time to talk about his father, he said 3 empty phrases about a great businessman and a legacy of success. Not one word about the man who taught him to ride a bike. Not one word about the one who took him fishing on Sundays. Only business, only money, only image. I spoke after him. I spoke about the mornings Arthur brought me coffee in bed, about how we danced in the kitchen without music, about the nights he held me and told me I was the strongest woman he had ever known. My voice broke several times. But I finished. Some people cried. Kyle yawned. 3 days later, we were in Stephen's office for the reading of the will. The place smelled like old leather and ancient paper. There was a large window that let in the afternoon light, illuminating the dust floating in the air. Kyle sat as if he owned the place, legs crossed, playing with his gold watch that cost more than $20,000. I sat across from him, still wearing black, still feeling the emptiness of Arthur's absence with every breath. Stephen opened the envelope with the red wax seal. He cleared his throat. The last will and testament of Arthur Harrison, he began in that formal voice lawyers have. I felt my heart beating so hard I thought everyone could hear it. Kyle drummed his fingers on the arm of the chair, impatient. To my son, Kyle Harrison, Stephen read, I leave the company, Harrison Industries, valued at approximately $80 million, with all its subsidiaries, corporate accounts, commercial properties, and projects in development. Kyle smiled. That smile I knew so well. The smile of someone who always gets what he wants without effort. He leaned back in his chair, triumphant, as if he had just won a competition no one else was playing. Then Stephen continued. To my beloved wife, Eleanor Harrison, who cared for me with unconditional love during my illness, I leave the family farmhouse, located at mile marker 82 on the old highway towards Springfield, with its surrounding land and all the belongings contained within it. The silence that followed was so heavy, I could feel it pressing against my chest. Kyle blinked. Once. Twice. Then his smile widened into something almost cruel. That's it? He asked, looking at Stephen. Mom gets the old farmhouse. He laughed. a short, dry laugh that cut through me like a knife. "Kyle," I said softly, feeling my cheeks burn with shame. But he didn't stop. He stood up from his chair and walked to the window, still laughing. "It's unbelievable. Absolutely unbelievable." He turned to me, and in his eyes, I saw something I had never seen before: pure contempt. "Mom, do you realize? You took care of him your whole life. 30 years making him breakfast, ironing his clothes, putting up with his moods. 3 months wiping his mouth when he couldn't eat on his own. And for what? To be left with that ruin that's falling apart. While He spread his arms as if embracing an invisible empire. "I get an $80 million business. Because I do deserve more. I actually did something with my life." Every word was a slap. I felt tears burning behind my eyes, but I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing me cry. Jessica, his wife, looked away, uncomfortable. Stephen remained seated behind his desk, a strange expression on his face, as if he was waiting for something. "Your father wanted you to have the company," I said, my voice trembling. "He always talked about leaving you his legacy, and he left you an abandoned house." Kyle laughed again. "Mom, that house isn't even worth $200,000. Probably less. The walls are cracked. The roof leaks. It's in the middle of nowhere while He tapped his chest with his finger. "I have buildings downtown, international contracts, bank accounts you can't even imagine." He moved closer to me and leaned in, lowering his voice as if confiding a secret. "Dad knew who was really worth something in this family. And it wasn't you." Something broke inside me in that moment. It wasn't my heart. That had already broken when Arthur died. It was something deeper. It was the illusion that my son, somewhere beneath all that arrogance, still had some humanity. Then Stephen cleared his throat. We all turned to him. His hands were clasped on the desk, and his eyes moved between Kyle and me with an intensity that hadn't been there before. "There is something else," he said slowly. Kyle rolled his eyes. "More? What more could there be? He left Mom the old lawnmower too." Stephen ignored him. He looked directly at me. "Mrs. Harrison, your husband left very specific instructions. This letter." He pulled a yellow envelope from a drawer. "It must be opened by you, alone, when you visit the farmhouse for the first time." He extended the envelope toward me. Kyle snorted. "A letter? Seriously? What's it going to say? Sorry for leaving you destitute." He turned to his wife. "Let's go, Jessica. We have more important things to do than watch this drama." But Stephen wasn't finished. "Actually," he said those 2 words with a weight that made us all stop. Kyle froze, mid-step toward the door. Stephen continued, now looking at Kyle with something that looked almost like pity. "Actually, Mr. Harrison, your father also left instructions for you. Instructions you must follow to the letter if you wish to keep the company." Kyle's face changed. The arrogant smile vanished like smoke. "What kind of instructions?" he asked. And for the first time since he entered the office, his voice sounded unsure. "That will be revealed in due time," Stephen said, closing the folder in front of him. "For now, the will has been read. The transfer of assets will begin tomorrow." Kyle turned pale, completely pale. He opened his mouth to say something, but no sound came out. He just looked at me, those eyes suddenly looking like a frightened child's, not those of the arrogant man from a minute ago. Then he walked out of the office without another word, dragging Jessica behind him. I sat there, holding the yellow envelope in my trembling hands, feeling its weight, wondering what on earth Arthur had planned. Stephen stood up and came to sit in the chair next to me. "Mrs. Harrison," he said softly, "your husband was a very wise man, and he loved you more than you can imagine. Trust him. Trust this." He pointed to the envelope. I nodded, though I understood nothing. I left the office on shaky legs, feeling the receptionist's eyes follow me as I walked onto the street. It was raining outside, a fine drizzle that made everything look blurry. I got into my old car, the one Arthur and I bought 15 years ago, and just sat there, holding the steering wheel, breathing. The farmhouse. I hadn't been there in years. Ever since Arthur got sick, we hadn't had time for anything but doctors and medicine. But I remembered that house. I remembered the summers when Kyle was little, running through the trees, laughing. I remembered the nights on the porch, with Arthur playing his guitar while I read. I remembered the smell of damp earth after the rain, the sound of birds at dawn. And now that house was mine, along with a yellow envelope and a mystery my dead husband had left behind. I didn't know what was in that envelope. I didn't know what instructions Arthur had left for Kyle. But as I drove through the rain toward my empty apartment, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Curiosity. And beneath that curiosity, buried but present, a tiny spark of something that might have been hope. What would happen next would change everything. But in that moment, as the drops hit my windshield, I was just a 64-year-old widow, humiliated by her own son, clinging to the last words of her dead husband. "Trust me," Arthur had said, and that was exactly what I was going to do. I spent that whole night awake in my apartment, staring at the yellow envelope on the kitchen table. I couldn't open it. Stephen had been clear. I had to open it at the farmhouse, not before. But my hands trembled every time I looked at it, as if the paper could burn me. I made coffee 3 times that night. I let it get cold all 3 times without taking a sip. Outside, the city slept, but I was trapped in a whirlwind of memories and unanswered questions. I thought about Arthur, about how he had changed during those last few months. Not just physically, though watching him wither away was the hardest thing I ever had to face. But mentally, there was something in his eyes, especially in those last few weeks, as if he was calculating something. As if every conversation, every silence, was part of a larger plan I couldn't see. I remembered one specific night, 2 weeks before he died. Kyle had called to cancel his visit again. Important meeting with the Japanese investors, he had said over the phone, without even asking how his father was. I hung up and went back to the room where Arthur was lying, connected to the oxygen machine that hissed softly in the dark. I thought he was asleep. But when I sat in the chair by his bed, he opened his eyes. "Was that Kyle?" he asked, his voice weak, breaking my heart every time I heard it. "Yes, I lied," he says, "to send his love." I couldn't tell him the truth. I couldn't hurt him any more than he already was. But Arthur knew me too well. He smiled, though it was more a grimace of pain than a real smile. "Eleanor, my love, you were never any good at lying." He reached his bony hand out to me. I took it, feeling his fingers tremble. "Do you know what my biggest mistake as a father was?" he whispered. I shook my head, feeling the tears welling up. I gave Kyle everything. Everything. He never had to fight for anything. He never had to earn anything. And in doing that, his voice broke. In doing that, I robbed him of the chance to become a real man. I turned him into a spoiled child in an adult's body. "Arthur, don't say that," I whispered. "He's our son." "He's a stranger," he said with a sadness that cut through me like a knife. "A stranger who carries my name, but not my values. And that's my fault." He squeezed my hand tighter. "But there's still time to fix it. Eleanor, there's still time to teach him what's really important." I didn't understand what he meant. Not then. But now, sitting in my kitchen at 3 a.m, holding that yellow envelope, I was beginning to understand. Arthur had planned something. Something that began long before I even realized. When the sun finally came up, I dressed in comfortable clothes, put the envelope in my purse, and drove out to the farmhouse. The drive was long, almost 2 hours on increasingly empty roads. I left the city with its tall buildings and constant noise behind, drove through the suburbs with their identical houses, and finally hit the old highway that snaked through green hills and abandoned fields. I had forgotten how beautiful this drive was. The trees formed a natural tunnel over the road, their branches intertwined like praying fingers. The air coming through the open window smelled like damp grass and earth. There was no traffic, no rush. Just me, the hum of my old car's engine, and the song of birds flying from tree to tree. At mile marker 82, I turned onto the dirt road that led to the house. My heart began to beat faster. The tires kicked up dust as I drove slowly between the trees. And then I saw it. The farmhouse. Our house. Kyle was right about one thing. It was old. The white paint on the walls had peeled in many places, revealing the dark wood underneath. The red shingled roof had a few broken tiles. The windows were filthy, covered in dust and cobwebs. The garden I had tended with so much love was now wild, overgrown with tall weeds and wildflowers that had taken over. The wooden porch creaked under my feet as I climbed the 3 steps to the front door. But despite all that, despite the neglect and the time, the house was still beautiful. It had soul. It had history. It had memory in every board, in every stone, in every corner. This house had seen Kyle's first birthday, his first steps, his first words. It had seen my 10th, 15th, 20th wedding anniversaries. It had heard laughter, songs, whispered promises on summer nights. I put the old key in the lock. It was rusty, and I had to jiggle it a bit, but it finally turned with a metallic click. I pushed the door open. It screeched on its hinges like a long, tired sigh. The air that came out smelled musty, of accumulated dust, of stored-away memories. I walked in slowly. Sunlight streamed through the dirty windows, creating golden beams filled with floating dust particles. The furniture was covered with white sheets, making them look like ghosts frozen in time. I walked through the living room, my footsteps echoing in the silence. There were photographs on the walls, covered in dust but still visible. Kyle at 5 years old, smiling with missing teeth. Arthur and me on our wedding day, so young I barely recognized us. A family photo at Christmas, the 3 of us in front of the tree, happy. I stopped in front of that last photograph. When had we stopped being like that? When had the smiling boy turned into the cruel man who mocked me yesterday? When had love turned into contempt? I kept walking, exploring each room as if for the first time. The kitchen still had the cream-colored curtains I had sewn myself. The dining room had the long table where we celebrated every Sunday. The bathroom still had the ivory-colored tiles Arthur had installed himself one summer, working in the sun until his hands bled. I went up the stairs to the 2nd floor. Each step creaked with a different sound, like keys on an out-of-tune piano. Upstairs there were 3 bedrooms. Kyle's room, with his sports team posters still taped to the walls. The guest room, empty except for a bed and a dresser. And at the end of the hall, our room, Arthur's and my room. I pushed the door open gently. The bed was still made with the lavender-colored sheets I had put on the last time we were here, years ago. The dresser had my old hairbrush, my mirror, some cheap jewelry I never wore. On Arthur's side, there was a half-read book, his reading glasses on top of it, as if he might come back at any moment to finish the chapter. I sat on the edge of the bed and finally cried. I cried for everything I had lost. I cried for the husband who was gone. I cried for the son who had become a stranger. I cried for this house full of memories that was now empty and cold. Tears fell onto my hands as my body shook with sobs I had been holding in since the funeral. I don't know how long I sat there, maybe 10 minutes, maybe an hour. But when I finally dried my eyes and took a deep breath, I felt something different. A calm. As if the house itself had hugged me and told me everything would be all right. I remembered the envelope. I took it out of my purse, my hands not shaking quite as much. Stephen had said I must open it here, in the house. This was the moment. This was the place. I stood up and walked to Arthur's desk. It was by the window overlooking the backyard. From there, I could see the fruit trees he had planted, the old swing set he had built for Kyle, the stone path that led to the small pond where we used to sit and watch the stars. I sat in the wooden chair. The yellow envelope glowed in the sunlight. On the front, in Arthur's shaky handwriting, it simply said, "For Eleanor, my eternal love." I slid my finger under the flap and opened it carefully. Inside were several folded sheets of paper and something else. Something small and metallic that fell onto the desk with a soft clink. It was a key, an antique golden key with an ornate design on the head. I unfolded the pages with trembling hands. Arthur's handwriting filled every sheet, written in black ink, and as I began to read the first lines, I felt my entire world begin to change. Word by word, letter by letter. "My dearest Eleanor," the letter began, "if you are reading this, it means I am no longer with you. It means I finally lost the battle I knew I was going to lose. But before I went, I needed to do something. I needed to fix the biggest mistake of my life. I needed to teach our son a lesson I should have taught him years ago." My eyes filled with tears again. But I kept reading. What Kyle doesn't know is that the company he inherited is in serious trouble. Trouble that I intentionally created over these last few months. Fake contracts, hidden debts, ghost investments, all designed to look real on the surface, but which will collapse in a matter of weeks. The company he believes is worth $80 million is actually worth nothing. It's an empty shell. An illusion. I froze. I reread those lines 3 times to make sure I had understood correctly. Arthur had sabotaged his own company? I continued reading, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The real fortune, my love, is where it always was. In this house, in the place where we were happy, in the place where we built our most valuable memories. And now it is all yours, as it always should have been. My hands were shaking so much, I had to put the letter down on the desk to keep reading. Arthur's words danced in front of my eyes. It couldn't be real. It couldn't be true what I was reading. I know this sounds cruel, Eleanor. I know you're thinking I'm a terrible man for doing this to our son. But hear me out. Kyle needs to learn what I never taught him. He needs to understand that money without character is worthless. That success without humility is a castle made of sand. I took a deep breath, feeling the air fill my lungs with a sharp pain. Arthur had planned all of this. Every detail. Every move. While I was caring for him, while I was wiping his forehead and holding his hand, he was orchestrating this monumental lesson for our son. For the last 6 months, before the cancer weakened me too much, I worked in secret with Stephen. We moved assets. We created shell companies. We forged contracts that look real but aren't. Kyle inherited a mirage. A company that on paper is worth millions, but in reality is just debt and air. The Japanese investors he mentioned so often don't exist. The corporate bank accounts are empty. I had to get up from the chair. I walked to the window, pressing my forehead against the cool glass. Outside, the wild garden swayed in the breeze. My mind tried to process what I had just read. Arthur had destroyed his own company, the company he built for 30 years, all to teach Kyle a lesson. I went back to the desk and continued reading, my heart racing. But here is the truth, my love, the truth that only you and Stephen know. Before I got sick, I secretly sold off the real assets of the company, the valuable properties, the patents, the real contracts, everything. I converted it to cash and solid investments. And I hid it. I hid it in the one place Kyle would never think to look. In this old farmhouse that he despises so much. My eyes flew open. I looked around the room as if the walls themselves would reveal their secrets. The golden key gleamed on the desk. Waiting. The key you found opens something special. Eleanor, do you remember the study? My little space on the first floor where I said I went to read and think. I always asked you not to come in there. But there was a reason for that secrecy. I stood up so fast the chair nearly fell over behind me. The study. That small room next to the kitchen that Arthur always kept locked. I never went in there without his permission. It was his space, his sanctuary. I hurried down the stairs as fast as I could, holding the letter in one hand and the key in the other. My feet pounded on the wooden steps, creating a frantic rhythm. I reached the first floor and turned down the narrow hallway next to the kitchen. There was the door, a dark wooden door with an antique brass lock. I put the golden key in the lock. It turned smoothly, as if it had been recently oiled. The click was almost musical. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The study was small. There was a simple desk against the back wall, a worn leather chair, shelves filled with old books. On the left wall was a large painting, a seascape Arthur had bought at an auction years ago. I went back to the letter, searching for the next instruction. Behind the painting of the sea, Eleanor. Behind my childhood memories. That's where it all is. That's where the truth of what our life together is really worth. I approached the painting on shaky legs. I ran my fingers over the golden frame, feeling the dust. Then, carefully, I lifted one side of the painting and moved it away. What I saw behind it made me gasp. There was a safe built into the wall. It was old, black metal with a golden combination dial in the center, and on the door of the safe, there was a note stuck to it. A small, yellow note in Arthur's handwriting. The combination is our anniversary, the day you said yes, the day my life truly began. My fingers trembled as I spun the dial. Right to 27, left to 9, right to 83. The numbers of our anniversary. September 27th, 1983. I heard a deep click from within the safe. The handle moved easily when I pressed it down. I opened the door slowly, and what I saw inside made me fall to my knees. The safe was full, completely full. There were stacks of cash, all in dollars, arranged in perfect piles. There were documents in manila folders. There were small velvet boxes. There were flash drives. And in the center of it all, there was another envelope. This one was white, larger than the yellow one, and had the full inventory written on it. I picked it up with hands that no longer felt like my own. I opened it. Inside were several printed sheets, each with detailed lists. I began to read and felt my breath catch. Cash in safe, $850,000. Certificates of deposit at National Bank, $12 million. Stocks in tech companies, $32 million. Real estate properties downtown, $18 million. Government bonds, $9 million. Investments in index funds, $15 million. I kept reading. Properties, investments, bank accounts. Stocks, bonds, patents valued in the millions. At the bottom of the list, written in Arthur's shaky hand, was the total, approximate value of all assets, $93 million, all in the name of Eleanor Harrison. $93 million. I stayed there, kneeling in front of the open safe, holding that paper, reading and rereading that number until it stopped having meaning. 93 million. Me. Eleanor, the woman Kyle had called poor. The woman who had been humiliated while her son laughed at her poverty. I had $93 million, and Kyle had an empty company that would collapse in weeks. I picked up Arthur's letter again with trembling hands. I found where I had left off and continued reading through the tears that were now streaming freely down my cheeks. This is not revenge, Eleanor. It's an opportunity. When the company collapses, Kyle will have two choices. He can let himself be destroyed by pride, or he can learn humility. He can come to you, head bowed, and ask for forgiveness. He can finally understand that a person's true worth isn't in what they own, but in how they treat others. I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand. I am leaving all this money to you because you deserve it, but also because I trust your heart. I trust you will know what to do when the time comes. If Kyle changes, if he truly changes, then you will be the one to decide if he deserves a second chance. I folded the letter against my chest, hugging it as if it were Arthur himself. I could feel his presence in that room. I could hear his voice reading those words to me. I have loved you from the moment I saw you, Eleanor, and I will love you long after my last breath is gone. If this is my final lesson, I hope it is enough to fix what I broke when I spoiled our son. The letter ended with a simple line. Yours forever, even in the silence, Arthur. I stayed there on the floor of the study, surrounded by millions of dollars, holding my dead husband's last letter, weeping. Arthur had given me more than money. He had given me choice. He had given me dignity. He had given me the last word in a story Kyle thought was already over. But the story was just beginning. I spent the rest of that day at the farmhouse, just sitting on the floor of the study, staring at the contents of the safe as if at any moment it would all disappear. As if it were a dream I would wake up from in my small apartment, widowed and poor, exactly as Kyle had assumed I was. But it wasn't a dream. The stacks of cash were real. The documents with my name on them were real. The folders with property titles, investment certificates, it was all absolutely real. I picked up one of the stacks of cash and held it in my hands. They were $100 bills, crisp, new, still with the paper band from the bank. I counted 20 bills, $2,000 in my hand. And there were hundreds of these stacks in the safe. I laughed. It was a strange, almost hysterical laugh that escaped my throat without permission. Then I cried again. Then I sat in silence, just breathing, trying to process this new reality. Eleanor Harrison, 64 years old, widow, had just discovered she was a multi-millionaire. The sun began to set, painting the study in shades of orange and violet that streamed through the dirty window. I pulled my phone from my pocket. I had 3 missed calls, all from a number I didn't recognize. None from Kyle. Of course not. My son was probably out celebrating his new fortune, drinking expensive champagne, planning how to spend his imaginary millions. I thought about calling Stephen, the lawyer, to confirm this was all real. But something stopped me. Arthur had left clear instructions in his letter. Stephen knew everything. He was part of the plan. The answers would come when they were meant to. For now, I just needed to absorb the truth. I closed the safe carefully, spun the combination to lock it, and put the painting back in its place. From the outside, no one would ever know a fortune was hidden behind that painting of the sea. I left the study, locked the door, and put the golden key in my purse along with Arthur's letters. I walked through the house as it grew dark, touching the walls, the sheet-covered furniture, the picture frames. This house that Kyle had called a ruin. This house he had despised in front of the lawyer. This house was worth more than any corporate high-rise downtown, not because of the money hidden inside it, but because of what it represented. Love. Memory. Lessons my husband had saved for the exact moment they were needed most. That night, I slept in our old bed, wrapped in the lavender-colored sheets that smelled like dust and time, but I didn't mind. I dreamed of Arthur. I dreamed we were sitting on the porch, him playing his guitar, me reading a book, while a little Kyle chased butterflies in the yard. Everything was peaceful. Everything was simple. Everything was real. The next morning, I drove back to the city with a mental clarity I hadn't had in months. I knew what was coming. I knew Kyle's company would begin to collapse soon. Arthur had said it would take weeks. And I needed to be ready to watch, not to intervene. Not yet. Just to watch. 5 days passed before I got the first sign. I was at the grocery store, buying vegetables for dinner, when my phone rang. It was Jessica, Kyle's wife. I hesitated before answering. Jessica and I had never been close. She was a cold, elegant woman who always looked at me as if I were part of the family's old furniture. "Hello?" I answered, holding the phone between my ear and shoulder as I put tomatoes in my bag. Eleanor, her voice was tense, almost hysterical. "I need to talk to you. It's about Kyle." My heart sped up. "What happened? Is he all right?" He's having problems with the company. Big problems." I heard her take a deep, shaky breath. "The Japanese investors pulled out. They just disappeared. And there's something wrong with the accounts. The banks are calling about loans Kyle says he didn't know existed. Eleanor, I think we're in real trouble." I closed my eyes, feeling a mix of pain for my son and something else. Something I was ashamed to admit. Satisfaction. The wheel Arthur had set in motion was beginning to turn. "What does Kyle say?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. "He says there's a mistake, that his father couldn't have left him the company like this, that something's wrong with the documents. But Stephen, the lawyer, assures him everything is in order, that the company is exactly as Arthur left it." Jessica paused. "Eleanor, did your husband say anything to you before he died? Anything about the company?" "No," I lied softly. "Arthur rarely talked about business with me." I heard a sigh of frustration on the other end. "All right. I just thought I'd ask. Kyle is under a lot of stress. He isn't sleeping. He spends every night going over documents, making calls. He says he's going to fix it, but—" Her voice cracked slightly. "But I'm scared, Eleanor." After I hung up, I stood in the middle of the grocery aisle, holding my phone, feeling the weight of what was to come. Kyle was beginning to understand that something was terribly wrong. And this was only the beginning. The next few days, I started to hear whispers. I lived in the same city. I went to the same places. People talk, especially about prominent families that are falling. At the bakery, I heard 2 women whispering about how the Harrison son was having trouble with his inheritance. At the bank, the teller who was always so nice to me mentioned he'd heard Harrison Industries was facing an unexpected audit. At the hair salon, my stylist Carla asked me point blank, "Is it true your son is losing your husband's company?" I didn't confirm anything. I just smiled sadly and said I didn't know much about business. But inside, I could feel Arthur's plan unfolding exactly as he had predicted. 2 weeks after the will reading, Kyle finally called me. It was late, almost 11 o'clock at night. I was in my apartment, reading Arthur's letter for the 10th time, when my phone lit up the dark. I saw his name on the screen and my heart leaped. This was the first time he had contacted me since the day of the humiliation in the lawyer's office. I answered. "Kyle." "Mom." His voice sounded different, tired, broken. "Mom, I need to ask you something. Tell me. Did Dad tell you anything? Anything about the company? About financial problems?" He was talking fast, almost desperate. "Because I'm finding things, Mom, terrible things. There are debts everywhere. Fake contracts. Investments that don't exist. It's like someone hollowed out the company and left nothing but a shell." I stayed silent, listening to his ragged breathing on the other end. "Suppliers are demanding payment," he continued. "Payments for huge amounts we supposedly owed for months. But there's no money. Mom, the accounts are empty. Everything I thought I had, it's all a lie." "Kyle," I said softly, feeling my own tears start to form. No matter how cruel he had been, he was still my son. "What are you going to do?" There was a long silence. Then I heard something that broke my heart. My adult son, my arrogant, overbearing son, was crying. "I don't know," he whispered. "I don't know, Mom. I thought I had it all figured out. I thought I was a success. But it's all falling apart and I don't know how to stop it." I wanted to tell him the truth right then. I wanted to tell him I knew exactly what was happening, that his father had planned all of this, that it was a lesson. But Arthur's words echoed in my mind. "Trust me. Let him learn." "I'm so sorry, son," was all I said. "I wish I could help you." He hung up without saying goodbye, and I stayed there, in the dark of my apartment, holding the phone, feeling the second part of Arthur's plan begin to unfold. The fall was no longer just financial, now it was emotional. And that meant the real test was just beginning. The following weeks were like watching a skyscraper collapse in slow motion. Every day brought new word of Kyle's downfall, and while part of me ached for him, another part, a part I was ashamed to acknowledge, felt like justice was finally being served. 3 weeks after the will reading, I saw the first article in the local paper. It was small, buried in the business section. Harrison Industries facing lawsuits from multiple suppliers for unpaid bills. I read every word as I sipped my morning coffee. The article mentioned that the company, recently inherited by Kyle Harrison after his father's death, was under investigation for potential financial irregularities. Several suppliers claimed they were owed amounts totaling over $3 million. I folded the newspaper slowly. $3 million. And that was just the start. Arthur had been meticulous in his plan. He had created such a complex web of fake debts and ghost contracts that unraveling it would take months, maybe years. And by the time Kyle fully understood the scope of the disaster, it would be too late. Jessica called me again that week. Her voice sounded even more desperate than the last time. "Eleanor, we had to sell Kyle's car, the sports car he loved so much. We needed the money to pay the lawyers. There are 4 different firms suing the company." "I'm so sorry, Jessica," I said, and I meant it. Not for the car, but for seeing my son learning in the most painful way possible. "He doesn't sleep," she continued, her voice trembling. "He spends every night in his office, going through papers, trying to find where the money is. But there is no money, Eleanor. Your husband left him a time bomb." I had to bite my tongue to keep from saying, "Exactly, that was the point." A month after the will reading, I ran into Kyle by accident. I was at the bank, making a small deposit from my pension, when I saw him coming out of the manager's office. He hadn't seen me. I could watch him without him knowing. And what I saw shocked me. My son had lost weight. A lot of weight. His expensive suit, the one he wore to show off, now hung on him, draped over his shoulders like a rag. He had deep, dark circles, purple marks under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. His hair, always perfectly styled, was disheveled and greasy. He walked with his shoulders slumped, staring at the floor, a defeated man. I hid behind a pillar, watching him leave the bank. As he passed me, I heard him muttering to himself. Words I couldn't make out, but the tone was one of pure desperation. My heart clenched. This was my son, my baby, the boy I had held in my arms, the boy I had nursed when he was sick. and now he was being destroyed by the consequences of his own arrogance. But Arthur was right. This was necessary. Painful, but necessary. That night, I sat in my apartment and opened my old laptop. I searched for Harrison Industries online. The results made me hold my breath. There were dozens of new articles. Harrison Industries on the brink of bankruptcy. Heir unable to uphold father's legacy. Family empire in freefall after founder's death. I read several of them. They all told the same story from different angles. Kyle had inherited what looked like an empire, but in reality, it was a house of cards. Employees were quitting. Clients were canceling contracts. Investors were pulling their support. The company that was once worth $80 million was now being valued at less than $5 million and dropping daily. One article included a brief interview with a former employee. Mr. Arthur Harrison was a business genius, the man said. But his son didn't inherit that talent. Or maybe he inherited a company that was already broken. We don't know. All we know is that in 2 months, Kyle Harrison has destroyed what his father built in 30 years. I closed the laptop, a lump in my throat. The world blamed Kyle. They thought he had ruined his father's legacy through incompetence. No one knew the truth. No one knew this was exactly what Arthur had planned. A brutal lesson wrapped in the guise of a disaster. 2 months after the will reading, I had an unexpected visitor. It was 8 o'clock at night when someone knocked on my door. I looked through the peephole, and my heart nearly stopped. It was Kyle, but not the arrogant Kyle who had humiliated me in the lawyer's office. This Kyle was a ghost of that man. He was even thinner. His once elegant clothes were now wrinkled and stained. His eyes were red, as if he had been crying for hours. He had several days' worth of stubble. He looked like a homeless man, not the successful businessman he once pretended to be. I opened the door slowly. "Kyle," I whispered. He looked at me with those devastated eyes and just collapsed. He fell to his knees on my doorstep, covering his face with his hands, sobbing like a child. "Mom," he wailed. "Mom, I lost everything. Everything." I knelt beside him, not caring that we were in the hallway where the neighbors could see us. I put my hand on his shoulder. He was shaking violently. "Come in," I said gently. "Let's go inside." I helped him to his feet and guided him into my small apartment. He sat on my old sofa, the one I'd had for 15 years, and leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. I sat beside him, waiting. I didn't know what to say. Arthur's words echoed in my mind. "Let him come to you. Let him ask for help." "The company's gone," he finally said, his voice hollow. "We declared bankruptcy this morning. Everything Dad built, everything I thought I inherited, it's gone. Like smoke." He ran his hands through his greasy hair. "And the worst part is, everyone thinks it's my fault. That I ruined Dad's legacy. That I'm an incompetent failure." "Kyle," I began, but he cut me off. "No, Mom. Let me finish." He looked me straight in the eyes for the first time since he'd arrived. "I need to tell you something. Something I should have told you months ago." He took a deep, shuddering breath. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry for how I treated you in the lawyer's office. I'm sorry I mocked you. I'm sorry I said the farmhouse was a ruin. I'm sorry I wasn't there when Dad was dying. I'm sorry I've been a terrible son." Tears were streaming down his cheeks now, cutting clean paths through his dirty face. "You took care of him when I wouldn't. You loved him when I only thought about money. And I repaid you with humiliation. With contempt. As if you were worthless just because you didn't have a corporate title or a big bank account." My own vision blurred with tears. This was the first time in years, maybe decades, that Kyle had spoken from the heart. The first time he had shown real vulnerability. The first time he had acknowledged his mistakes. "I lost the luxury apartment," he continued. "I lost the cars. I lost the bank accounts. Jessica left me last week. She ran off with some lawyer she met at one of the hearings. She said she couldn't be with a loser." He laughed bitterly. "And she's right. I am a loser. An arrogant loser who thought he deserved everything without ever earning it." He covered his face with his hands again. "I have nothing, Mom. Nothing. I'm living in a cheap motel, paying with the last credit card that still works. I have no job. I have no money. I have no dignity. I have nothing. Except the shame of knowing I despised the only person who truly loved me. I hugged him then. I held him tight, feeling his body rack with deep sobs. He was my son, my baby, and no matter how much he had hurt me, he was still my son. "Oh, honey," I whispered, stroking his hair like I used to when he was little. "You're here now. That's what matters." We stayed like that for a long time, mother and son, reunited in grief and loss. And as I held him, I thought of Arthur. I thought of his elaborate plan. I thought of how he had predicted this exact moment. The collapse, the humiliation, the revelation, and finally, the repentance. Kyle had hit rock bottom. He had lost everything he valued. And in the process, maybe, just maybe, he had found something more valuable: humility, awareness, the ability to see beyond the money. Now came the hardest part of Arthur's plan: deciding what to do next. Kyle stayed at my apartment that night. I made up the bed on the sofa, gave him one of Arthur's old shirts I still kept, and watched as he fell asleep almost instantly. Exhaustion had finally overtaken his body. As he slept, he looked so young, so vulnerable, like the boy he used to be before money, and arrogance twisted him into someone unrecognizable. I couldn't sleep. I sat in my chair by the window, looking out at the city lights, holding Arthur's letter, which I now carried with me everywhere. I'd read it so many times I could recite every word from memory. But tonight, one sentence in particular resonated in my mind. "You will be the one to decide if he deserves a second chance." Arthur had given me the power. He had orchestrated all of this, destroyed his own company, humbled his son, all to get to this exact moment. The moment when Kyle, stripped of all his pride and arrogance, finally understood what really mattered. And now it was up to me to decide what to do with that lesson. I could stay silent. I could let Kyle go on thinking it was all a terrible accident, a bit of bad luck he'd inherited. I could keep the $93 million for myself, live out my days in comfort, while my son struggled to rebuild his life from scratch. That would be justice, wouldn't it? After how he'd treated me, after the humiliation, the contempt. But as I looked at my son sleeping on my old sofa, his face gaunt and his clothes rumpled, I knew that justice wasn't what Arthur had wanted. He had wanted redemption, not vengeance, but transformation. And transformation, true transformation, required more than just pain. It required hope, too. The next morning, I made coffee and toast. Kyle woke with a start, as if he'd forgotten where he was. He saw me in the kitchen, and for a moment, I saw panic in his eyes, as if he thought it had all been a dream and I was about to throw him out. But then I smiled gently and pointed to the table. "Come on, have some breakfast." He sat across from me, accepting the mug of coffee with shaky hands. He drank in silence, not looking at me. The shame was still too fresh, too raw. I let the silence stretch. I needed to think carefully about my next words, because what I said now would change everything. "Kyle," I began finally, "I need to tell you something. Something about your father." He looked up, his tired eyes filled with a new curiosity mixed with fear. "What is it, Mom?" I took a deep breath. "Your father left me more than just the farmhouse." I watched his brow furrow, confused. "He left me a letter that explained everything." "Explained what?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "The company, the bankruptcy. It was all planned, Kyle. Your father planned all of it." The silence that followed was so profound I could hear the clock ticking on the wall. Kyle stared at me, as if I'd spoken in a foreign language. "What?" he finally managed to say. I stood up and went to my bedroom. I came back with Arthur's letter and laid it on the table in front of him. "Read," I said simply. With trembling hands, Kyle unfolded the pages. I watched his eyes track back and forth, reading every word. I watched his expression change. Confusion, disbelief, shock, anguish, and finally, understanding. When he finished, he set the letter down on the table and covered his face with his hands. "He set me up," he whispered. "This whole time, all this agony, it was a lesson." "It wasn't a trap," I said softly. "It was a test of character. Your father loved you, Kyle, but he knew he had spoiled you, that he'd given you everything without teaching you the real value of things. And when he knew he was dying, he decided to give you one last gift, the chance to become the man he always knew you could be. Kyle lowered his hands and looked at me, his eyes brimming with tears. And the farmhouse? The inheritance he left you? I stood up again and retrieved the inventory of assets from my purse. I placed it in front of him. Read the last number. I watched his eyes scan the page, moving down, line by line, until they hit the total. When he saw it, his face went completely white. 93 million, he read aloud, his voice cracking. Mom, you have $93 million. Your father sold every real asset the company had months before he died. He converted it all to investments, property, cash, and he hid it all in the farmhouse. The house you called a ruin. The house you despised. I paused, letting the irony sink in. While you inherited an empty shell, I inherited the real fortune. Kyle stared at the paper for what felt like an eternity. Then, he started to laugh. A bitter, pained laugh that quickly turned into a sob. He was right, he choked out. He was completely right about me. I am exactly the selfish, arrogant man he thought I was. I mocked you. I humiliated you. While you were sitting on millions and I just had debt disguised as success. Kyle, I reached across the table and took his hand. Your father didn't do this to destroy you. He did it to save you. To teach you what I never could. That a person's worth isn't in their bank account. That true wealth is in how you treat people, in your character, in your humanity. He squeezed my hand, his tears splashing onto the table. Can you forgive me, Mom? After everything I said, everything I did, can you ever forgive me? I felt my own tears rolling down my cheeks. I already have, honey. I forgave you the moment you fell on my doorstep, because that's what mothers do. We forgive, we love, no matter what. I don't deserve it, he said, his voice broken. I don't deserve anything from you. Maybe not, I admitted. But forgiveness isn't about deserving. It's about choosing to love despite the pain. Your father gave you a hard lesson. Now, I'm going to give you something different. I'm going to give you a chance. Kyle looked up, his eyes filled with a desperate, fearful hope. What kind of chance? I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city waking up to the morning Sunday. The company is bankrupt. That can't be undone. But you can start over. Not with gifted money, not with inherited success, but with real work, with humility, with the understanding that everything you achieve from now on will be because you earned it yourself. How? He asked desperately. I have nothing. I have no real skills. All I knew how to do was run a company that turned out to be fake. I turned back to him. You have something more valuable than skills, Kyle. You have a second chance. And you have a mother who, despite everything, still believes in you. I paused. I'm going to help you, but not in the way you expect. I'm not giving you millions. I'm not buying you another company. I'm giving you something better. What? He whispered. I'm going to give you the opportunity to build something real, something of your own, from the ground up. I will give you a loan for $50,000. Not a gift, a loan, with low interest and a reasonable time to pay it back. Enough to start a small business, to rent a modest apartment, to live on while you build something with your own two hands. I looked him straight in the eye. But there are conditions. Anything, he said immediately. I'll do anything. First condition, you work honestly. Whatever you do it with integrity. No shortcuts, no manipulations. Second condition, you live modestly. No luxuries until you have paid back every single cent you owe me. Third condition, if you ever treat anyone at all with the contempt you treated me with, the loan is immediately void and you will owe it all back at once. Kyle nodded vigorously, tears still streaming down his face. I promise, Mom. I promise with all my heart. And the last condition, I added, my voice softer now. You visit your father's grave once a month. You talk to him. You tell him about your progress. You thank him for the lesson he gave you, no matter how painful it was. I will, he sobbed. I will, Mom. Thank you. Thank you for not giving up on me. I held him then, feeling his body tremble against mine. My son. My lost boy, finally finding his way home. Arthur had been right. He had always been right. Sometimes the greatest love is expressed through the hardest lessons. The months that followed were a slow, steady transformation. Kyle took the $50,000 loan and, for the first time in his life, had to make real decisions about how to use money. There was no safety net, no multi-million-dollar bank account waiting to bail him out if he failed. There was just him, his determination, and the second chance I had given him. He rented a small apartment on the outskirts of the city, a modest place with one bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and windows that looked out onto a narrow alley. Nothing like the luxury penthouse he had shared with Jessica. When I went to visit him for the first time, I cried. Not from sadness, but from pride. Because I saw how he had cleaned every corner himself, how he had bought used furniture that was in good condition, how he had framed an old photograph of Arthur, me, and him as a child and hung it on the living room wall. It's perfect, I told him. And I meant it. Because this small apartment represented something no penthouse ever had. It represented earned dignity, self-reliance, humility. Kyle decided to start a consulting business for small companies. He had learned a lot about management, even if his own experience had ended in disaster. But now he used that knowledge differently, not to show off or get rich quick, but to genuinely help other entrepreneurs who were just starting out. He charged modest fees, worked long hours, and treated every client with respect and dedication. The first few months were hard. There were weeks when he only landed one client. There were nights I called and heard him crying in frustration because a contract had fallen through. But he never gave up. And most importantly, he never once showed the arrogance that had once defined him. I visited him regularly. Not to give him more money, but to give him what he really needed. Company, encouragement, the motherly love that had been missing during so many years of emotional distance. We would cook together in his tiny kitchen. We talked about Arthur, about memories, about lessons learned the hard way. One evening, 4 months after he started his new business, Kyle invited me over for dinner. He had cooked the meal himself, something he had never done in his previous life. Simple spaghetti with tomato sauce, a salad, and bread from the corner bakery. A humble meal, but made with love. "Mom," he said as we ate, "I got my 10th client this week, and one of my first clients recommended me to 3 other companies. I think this is going to work. Slowly, but it's going to work." I smiled, my heart swelling with pride. "Your father would be so proud of you." His eyes filled with tears. "Do you really think so?" "I know so," I said with certainty. "This is exactly what he wanted. For you to learn to build something real, something that was yours on merit, not by inheritance." Kyle nodded, wiping his eyes on a napkin. "I went to his grave yesterday, like I promised. I told him about my progress, about how every dollar I earn now means something. Because I earned it honestly, because I earned it by treating people well." He paused, and I asked him for forgiveness, for not being there when he was dying, for being a terrible son, for needing to lose everything to finally understand what he tried to teach me my whole life. I reached my hand across the table and took his. "He heard you, honey. I'm sure of it." Another month passed. Kyle paid his first installment on the loan. Only $500, a tiny fraction of what he owed, but to him, it represented everything. When he came to my apartment to give me the check, his hands were shaking with emotion. "It's my first payment, Mom, earned with my own sweat, with my own work." I hugged him tight. "This check is worth more than all the millions you thought you inherited." In that time, I had been busy too. I had visited the farmhouse several times. I hired people to repair it, to restore it to the glory it once had. I didn't spend millions. I didn't turn it into a palace. I simply brought it back to what it always was. A home filled with love and memory. I fixed the roof. I painted the walls. I cleared the garden and planted new flowers. The house came alive again. I also began to use some of Arthur's money for good. I donated to hospitals that treated cancer patients in my husband's memory. I established scholarships for students from humble families who wanted to study business administration. I helped Patricia, my neighbor and friend, when her husband lost his job. I didn't flaunt the money. I didn't use it to show off. I used it for what Arthur would have wanted, to help others. 6 months after Kyle started his business, I got a call from Stephen, the lawyer. "Mrs. Harrison," he said, his voice pleased. "I've been keeping an eye on your son, and I must say, the transformation has been remarkable. Arthur left instructions for me as well, you know. He asked me to watch Kyle for the first year after his fall, to see if the lesson truly stuck." "And what have you observed?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "A different man," Stephen replied. "A humble man. A man who works hard. A man who treats everyone with respect, from the barista at the coffee shop to the CEO of a major company. His father would be profoundly proud." That night I called Kyle and asked him to come to my apartment the next day. I had something important to tell him. When he arrived, he looked nervous, as if he thought he'd done something wrong. I had him sit on the sofa, and I sat across from him. "Kyle, you have worked so hard these 6 months. You have honored every condition I set. You have visited your father's grave religiously. You have made your payments on time. You have treated everyone with respect and dignity." I paused. "Your father would be proud. And I am so proud." "Thanks, Mom," he said softly. "But I still have a long way to go. I still owe almost the entire loan. I'm still building my business. I'm still learning to be the man I should have been from the start." "I know," I said. "And that's why I want to do something." I pulled an envelope from my purse. "Your father left something else in his letter. Something that was only to be revealed if you passed the test of these first 6 months. If you proved the lesson was truly learned." Kyle took the envelope with trembling hands. He opened it and pulled out a letter. It was another letter from Arthur, in that shaky handwriting we both knew so well. Kyle began to read aloud, his voice cracking with every word. "My son, if you are reading this, it means you have changed. It means the hardest lesson I ever had to give has finally borne fruit. I don't expect you to forgive me for what I did. I know the pain was immense, but I hope you understand why it was necessary. I loved you too much to let you become the shallow, empty man you were on track to be. I loved you enough to destroy your fake world and force you to build a real one." Kyle paused, wiping his tears. He continued reading. "If you have made it this far, if you have shown humility, hard work, and character for these 6 months, then there is something else you must know. Your mother has my fortune. All of it. But that fortune is not just for her. It is for both of you. When she decides you are ready, when she sees you have truly changed, then she has the option to share it with you. Not as a gift, not as an easy inheritance, but as a recognition of your transformation." Kyle let the letter fall to his lap and looked at me with wide eyes. "Mom, I don't want your money. I don't need your money. You already gave me more than I ever deserved. You gave me a second chance. That's enough." I smiled, my own tears rolling down my cheeks. "I know, son. And that's exactly why I know you're finally ready." I stood up and went to my bedroom. I returned with a legal document. "This is a trust. I have placed $10 million in your name. But there are strict conditions." His eyes went wide. "Mom, I can't accept." "Listen to the conditions first," I interrupted. "You cannot touch the money for 5 years. In that time, you will continue to build your business with your own 2 hands. The money is invested and will grow. After 5 years, if you have maintained your integrity, if you have continued to treat people with respect, if you have continued to live with humility, then the money will be yours to do with as you see fit." Kyle was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice thick with emotion. 5 years is perfect, Mom, because by then I'll have built something real, something I can be truly proud of. And then I'll use that money not to buy luxuries, but to expand the good I can do, to help others, just like you helped me. I held him tight, our tears mingling. My son had died and been reborn. The arrogant man was gone. In his place was someone new, someone better, someone Arthur and I could both be genuinely proud of. A year after Arthur's death, I decided it was time to move back to the farmhouse. Not just to visit, but to stay, to live there permanently. My apartment in the city had served its purpose for decades, but it wasn't my home anymore. My home was where the memories lived, where Arthur and I had been happy, where the true inheritance had been hidden all along. The house was fully restored now. The freshly painted cream-colored walls glowed in the sunday. The new roof didn't leak. The windows were clean and open, letting in the fresh country air. The garden was thriving, full of red roses, white daisies, and sunflowers that followed the sun all day. The wooden porch had been reinforced and varnished, and I had placed the 2 rocking chairs Arthur and I used to use there. Kyle helped me move. He carried every box, every piece of furniture, with a dedication he had never shown before. His business was growing steadily. He now had 15 regular clients and had hired his first employee, a young man named Leo, who reminded Kyle of himself before the fall. Kyle treated him with patience and respect, teaching him not just about business, but about integrity and character. "This house is beautiful, Mom," Kyle said, placing a box in the living room. "I can't believe I ever called it a ruin. I was the one in ruins, not the house." I smiled, touching the wall fondly. This house always had soul. It just needed someone to see it. That afternoon, after we finished unpacking, I made fresh lemonade and we sat on the porch. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange, pink, and purple. The birds were singing in the trees. The air smelled of damp earth and wildflowers. It was perfect peace. "Mom," Kyle said after a long silence, "I want to tell you something. I met someone." I raised my eyebrows in surprise. "A woman?" He nodded, and I saw a blush creep up his neck. "Her name is Claire. She's a teacher at an elementary school. I met her when I went to give a free talk on personal finance to the teachers. She's different from Jessica. She's real, humble, kind. She doesn't care that I don't have money. In fact, when I told her my story about how I lost everything and had to start over, she said it made her respect me more. I felt my heart fill with joy. I would love to meet her. I told her about you," he continued. "I told her about Dad, about the lesson, about how you gave me a second chance when I didn't deserve one. She wants to meet you, too. She says any woman who can forgive and love the way you do must be extraordinary." "Bring her here," I said, taking his hand. "Bring her for dinner next Sunday. I'll make your father's favorite meal. Roast chicken with potatoes and vegetables. And we can talk about the future." Kyle's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "The future? A year ago, I didn't think I had a future. I thought my life was over. But now." He looked around, at the garden, at the colorful sky, at me. "Now I have more than I ever had when I thought I had it all." The following Sunday, Kyle arrived with Claire. She was a simple, beautiful woman, with brown hair pulled back in a ponytail, warm honey-colored eyes, and a genuine smile that lit up her face. She wore a simple, light green dress and comfortable shoes. No flashy jewelry, no heavy makeup, just natural, authentic beauty. "Mrs. Harrison," she said, hugging me sincerely, "it's an honor to finally meet you. Kyle talks about you all the time. The honor is all mine," I replied, feeling instantly that this woman was special. "And please, call me Eleanor." We ate dinner in the dining room, around the long table that had witnessed so many family meals. Claire helped serve the food, insisted on washing the dishes afterward, and spoke with refreshing honesty about her life. She was the youngest of 4, had grown up in a humble family, had worked her way through college to pay for her education, and now dedicated her life to teaching children in low-income communities. "I don't make a lot of money," she said with a smile. "But when a child who couldn't read finally understands the letters, when I see their eyes light up with comprehension, I feel like I'm the richest person in the world." I looked over at Kyle and saw the way he was watching her, with admiration, with love, but most importantly, with respect. This was a different love than the one he'd had with Jessica. This was a love built on shared values, on mutual respect, on an appreciation for the beauty in simple things. After dinner, Claire and I walked in the garden while Kyle cleaned the dishes. "Your son is a good man," she told me. "I know he's made mistakes in the past. He's told me everything. But what I admire most about him is that he doesn't hide those mistakes. He owns them. He learns from them. And he tries every day to be better than he was the day before. That's all a parent can ask for, I said softly. Not that our children be perfect, but that they be able to learn, to grow, to transform. Claire stopped by the red roses and gently touched a petal. Kyle told me his father orchestrated everything. The fall, the choice, all of it. At first, it sounded cruel. But now I understand. Sometimes the greatest love requires the hardest decisions. I nodded, feeling the familiar sting of tears. Arthur knew he didn't have much time, and he wanted to make sure Kyle was ready to live a real life, not a fake one built on unearned money and unearned arrogance. It worked, Claire said with certainty. The man I know is genuine, hardworking, and full of humility, and I'm in love with that man, not the man he used to be. That night, after Kyle and Claire had left, I sat on the porch with a hot cup of tea. The stars were brilliant in the dark country sky, millions of pinpricks of light you never saw in the city. The air was cool and filled with the sound of crickets. I took out Arthur's letter, the one I'd read hundreds of times, but that still brought me comfort. I read it one more time in the dim porch light, and when I reached the last line, "Yours forever, even in the silence," I whispered my reply to the wind. You did it, my love. You saved our son. And even though you aren't here anymore, I feel your presence in every corner of this house, in every lesson that bore fruit, in every tear that led to transformation. I miss you every day. But I know you're at peace, because the plan worked. Kyle is safe. The wind blew gently, rustling the leaves in the trees, and I could have sworn I heard a whisper, a familiar voice saying, "Thank you, my love, for having faith, for being strong, for doing what I couldn't do while I was alive." 2 months later, Kyle came to visit with exciting news. "Mom, I paid off half the loan, the entire half. My business is growing faster than I expected." And he paused, a huge grin on his face. "I asked Claire to marry me, and she said yes." I cried out with joy and hugged him tight. "That's wonderful, son, wonderful." "We want to get married here," he said, looking around the house with love. "In this house, in the garden, where you and Dad were happy, where I learned the most important lessons of my life. Would you give us your blessing?" "Of course," I said, tears of happiness streaming down my cheeks. Nothing would make me happier. We started planning the wedding. It would be simple, intimate, with only close friends and family. Claire wanted flowers from the garden for decorations. Kyle wanted the ceremony to be under the big tree where his father had built the swing set. He wanted there to be an empty chair in the front row with a photograph of Arthur, because even though he wasn't physically present, his spirit would be. The night before the wedding, Kyle and I sat on the porch, just as we had so many times over the last few months. "Mom," he said softly, "thank you. Thank you for not giving up on me. Thank you for giving me the chance I didn't deserve. Thank you for loving me even when I was unlovable. You were always lovable, honey," I said, taking his hand. "You just needed to find that out for yourself. And you did. Through the pain, through the loss, through the humility, you found out who you really are. And that man is extraordinary." We sat there in silence, watching the stars, feeling Arthur's presence in the wind, knowing that the next day a new chapter would begin not just for Kyle, but for all of us. A chapter written not with money or superficial success, but with love, character, and lessons learned in the deepest way possible. The wedding day dawned with a clear sky and a golden sun that bathed the garden in warm light. The flowers I had planted months ago were in full bloom. Red roses, white daisies, cheerful sunflowers that seemed to be celebrating right along with us. We had set up simple wooden chairs in a semicircle around the big tree, and right in the center of the front row, just as Kyle had asked, was an empty chair with Arthur's photograph, surrounded by white candles. Claire arrived early in the morning. She didn't wear an elaborate, expensive wedding gown. Instead, she chose a simple, ivory-colored dress that fell to her ankles with delicate lace on the shoulders. She wore fresh flowers from the garden in her brown hair. She was radiant with the natural light of a woman deeply in love and at peace. "Are you ready?" I asked as I helped her adjust her simple veil. She smiled, taking my hands. "More than ready. I feel like my whole life has been leading me to this moment." The guests began to arrive. There weren't many. Maybe 30 people in all. Kyle's genuine friends, Claire's colleagues from school, some of Kyle's clients who had become friends, Stephen the lawyer and his wife, and my friend Patricia from the neighborhood. Real people. People who valued character over cash. When the music began, Claire walked down the aisle alone. But when she reached the halfway point, Kyle stepped out from his place by the officiant and walked to her. He extended his arm, and she took it, and they walked the rest of the way together. As equals, as partners in life. The ceremony was simple but deeply emotional. Kyle and Claire wrote their own vows. When Kyle began to speak, his voice shook with emotion. Claire, 2 years ago, I was a different man. A man full of arrogance and empty of substance. I lost everything I thought defined me. But in that loss, I found myself. And I found you. Tears streamed freely down his face. I promised to love you, not with expensive gifts or empty luxuries, but with respect, dedication, and gratitude for every single day we have together. Claire wept as she said her own vows. Kyle, what I fell in love with was not the man you used to be, but the man you became. The humble man who owns his mistakes, the hardworking man who builds his success with his own 2 hands. That is the man I want to spend the rest of my life with. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, everyone cheered. But the thing that made me cry the hardest was what Kyle did after he kissed his wife. He turned to the empty chair with Arthur's photograph, walked over to it, and knelt. He touched the photo gently and whispered, "Thank you, Dad. Thank you for loving me enough to save me." The reception was in the garden. Homemade food that Claire, Patricia, and I had prepared for days. There was no $1,000 a bottle champagne. There was fresh lemonade and modest wine. There were no elaborate, expensive decorations. There were flowers from the garden and simple candles that glowed as the sun began to set. As everyone ate and laughed, I sat in my rocking chair on the porch. Stephen came over and sat in the rocker next to me. "Mrs. Harrison," he said with a satisfied smile, "Arthur asked me to give you something on Kyle's wedding day, if that day ever came." He pulled a small envelope from his jacket. "I believe that time has come." I took the envelope with trembling hands. It was white, sealed, with my name in Arthur's familiar handwriting. I opened it carefully and pulled out a short note. "My beloved Eleanor, if you are reading this on Kyle's wedding day, it means our son has finally found true love. It means the lesson worked, that the pain had a purpose, that the fall led to a rising." I took a shaky breath, wiping my tears so I could keep reading. Every night during my illness, as you slept in that uncomfortable chair by my bed, I prayed. I prayed for the courage to do what I had to do. I prayed that you would have the strength to see the plan through to the end. And I prayed that Kyle would have the humility to learn the lesson. Thank you for being the extraordinary woman you have always been. Thank you for loving our son even when he was not easy to love. The letter ended with lines that made me sob openly. The real inheritance I am leaving you both is not the money in the safe. The real inheritance is the lesson learned. It is the character forged through fire. It is the love that endures beyond death. It is the family rebuilt on a foundation of humility and truth. That is the inheritance worth more than all the millions in the world. I love you beyond words, beyond time. Yours eternally, Arthur. Stephen placed his hand on my shoulder as I wept. He was a wise man. And you are an extraordinary woman. Together, you saved your son. That night, after the party wound down, Kyle and Claire stayed with me at the house. The 3 of us sat on the porch, under the stars, sharing stories about Arthur. "Mom," Kyle said after a long silence, "I want you to know something. The money from the trust, the $10 million that will be available in 4 more years. Claire and I have already decided what we're going to do with it." "What are you going to do?" I asked, curious. "We're going to start a foundation," Claire said, her eyes shining with passion. "A foundation to help young entrepreneurs from humble backgrounds. We'll give them not just money, but mentorship and education on values and integrity. We want to give them what Dad gave you, a second chance." My heart filled with so much pride I thought it might burst. Arthur would be so proud. This is exactly what he would have wanted. Kyle took my hand. Everything I am now, everything good in me, it comes from you two. From Dad, who loved me enough to give me the hardest lesson. And from you, Mom, who loved me enough to give me the second chance. 2 years have passed since that day. Kyle and Claire now have a beautiful baby girl, and they named her Eleanor. Little Ellie has her grandfather Arthur's eyes. Kyle paid off the loan in full 6 months ago. His business is thriving. But more importantly, he is thriving in his soul. I live in the farmhouse, surrounded by beauty and peace. I use Arthur's money wisely to help others, to create opportunities, to spread love where it's needed. I don't live like a millionaire. I live like a woman who is rich in what truly matters: family, love, purpose. I visit Arthur's grave every week. I tell him about Kyle, about Claire, about little Ellie. I tell him how his plan worked better than any of us could have imagined. And though I know he can't answer, I feel his presence. I feel his love. I feel his approval. Because in the end, the true inheritance isn't measured in dollars. It's measured in lessons learned, in characters transformed, in love that transcends death. It's measured in second chances, seized, and families rebuilt on truth and humility. Some people get what they want. Others get what they need. Kyle needed to lose everything to find himself. I needed to see my son fall to witness his true rising. And Arthur needed to leave to finally teach the lesson that would change everything. That is the true inheritance. And it is worth more than all the millions in the world.